So I'm going to set this one to Malinauskas. Thanks very much, Premier, and thank you also, Catherine, for the very kind invitation for Peter and I to come and meet with you tonight to talk a bit about the state budget and also to field some questions. I'm very grateful that you'd all come out on a cooler night in winter. And I thought I might start my comments really by talking a bit about the context in which we framed this year's state budget, because it did directly inform some of the choices that we made. So from an economic perspective, there's no doubt that the last 18 months the state's economy has been performing incredibly strongly. Even on the day that we released the budget, we had the latest round of labour force data and another series of records broken. The total number of people employed in South Australia hit a new high, the total number of full-time jobs hit a new high, and we had a pleasing reduction in our unemployment rate at the same time as our participation rate went up, which is not usual. We've had record exports, we've had a record crop production over the last 12 months, and that's not just a one-off. We've had a series of those over the last 2 to 3 years. And we've continued to perform really strongly both in the private sector business investment statistics, in housing construction, of course, the general level of construction activity across the board. That's been great, of course, for those people who've benefited from it. But it's not just South Australia specific, it's happened across the country, as we all know, as the previous federal government deployed such a huge amount of fiscal stimulus into the national economy, and at the same time the Reserve Bank had pulled the cash rate down to 0.1 of a percentage point in a really significant move in monetary policy. That has generated a huge boost in economic activity and output for the country. Great news on the face of it. Of course, what we've been experiencing over the last 12 to 15 months now has been skyrocketing inflation as a result of that rampant economic activity. That huge additional demand in the economy, as well as some significant supply constraints that we weren't used to, driving prices up, really hurting households, having to pay higher prices, as well as businesses as well. And of course, in response to that, the Reserve Bank has been ratcheting up the cash rate in the fastest increase in interest rates in memory. And so those dual pressures on households, very high, very quickly increasing prices for essential goods and services, as well as escalating housing costs as people's mortgages go up, and even as people who've got investment properties have had to increase their rents for renters, have placed households under incredible pressure. And at the same time, as the Premier alluded to, we've had continued pressures on our healthcare system. And so, again, in the week that we released the budget only a couple of weeks ago, we still had 129 patients occupying beds in metropolitan hospitals suffering from COVID. Now, when we released our budget 12 months ago, our first budget after the state election, we certainly didn't predict that that would be the case. And so we've got this long, persistent experience of higher demand in our hospitals from COVID. And then at the same time, all of us, of course, are familiar with it being next to impossible to get an appointment to see your local GP. The nation's suffering a national GP shortage, and that's certainly making its presence felt here, not just in our local health clinics, but for South Australians who feel that they need medical attention. If they can't see their local GP, well, where do they go? Of course, the next port of call will be our hospitals and our emergency departments. So we knew in this budget we had to step up health resourcing even further than what we did in our first budget. And then in terms of housing, we have all been aware of the increasing number of pressures across every single part of our housing market. And it doesn't matter if it's crisis or emergency accommodation, if it's public housing, as the Premier was talking about before, if it's social housing provided by some of the non-government providers, the community housing providers, even if it's just affordable rentals or affordable properties for purchase, or first home buyers trying to get into the market, every single part of that spectrum of the housing market is in crisis. And it's all because of the same malady, and that is a fundamental lack of supply. So we knew in this budget we also had to start addressing that lack of supply, particularly in those parts of the housing market.